The amber bottles scattered across my kitchen counter like fallen soldiers, each one bearing the familiar labels I'd grown to depend on over the past decade. My grandson Danny stood between me and my morning medications, his jaw set in that stubborn line that reminded me so much of his father at that age. The difference was, his father had never looked at me with such naked pity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grandma Rose, these aren't your medicine, he said, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they think you're losing your mind. Look at the labels, really look. I adjusted my reading glasses and picked up the bottle of blood pressure medication I'd been taking for 8 years. The prescription label looked exactly as it always had, my name typed in neat black letters, Dr. Hendricks' signature at the bottom. But Danny's expression told a different story entirely. I don't understand what you're trying to say, I said, setting the bottle back down with more force than necessary. These are mine. I picked them up from Millfield Pharmacy yesterday, same as always. Danny pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of each bottle. The flash made me blink, and something cold settled in my stomach. When family members start documenting your behavior, it usually means they're building a case for something you're not going to like. I'm calling Dr. Hendricks, he said, already scrolling through his contacts. Something's not right here, and we're going to figure out what. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been living what I thought was a perfectly ordinary life for a 76-year-old widow in the small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania. My daily routine revolved around the morning news, afternoon gardening when the weather permitted, and evening phone calls with my daughter Linda, who lived 2 states away in Ohio with her family. Danny, my grandson, had moved back to town 6 months ago, after finishing his degree in biochemistry, ostensibly to help me with household maintenance, but really because his girlfriend had broken up with him, and he needed somewhere to lick his wounds. I didn't mind the company. The house had felt too quiet since my husband Frank passed 4 years ago, and Danny was easy enough to live with. He kept to himself mostly, working at the new research facility that had opened outside town, coming home tired but generally pleasant. He helped with the heavy lifting, fixed the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, and occasionally joined me for dinner when I made his favorite pot roast. What I didn't realize was how closely he'd been watching me. It started with small comments that I'd initially dismissed as the natural concern of a young man who'd never lived with an elderly person before. He'd ask if I'd remembered to take my medications, whether I'd eaten lunch, if I'd spoken to anyone that day. Normal questions, the kind that showed he cared. I found them endearing at first, evidence that despite his parents' messy divorce and his own recent heartbreak, he'd grown into a thoughtful young man. But then the questions became more specific, more probing. He wanted to know about my doctor appointments, what medications I was taking and why, whether I'd noticed any changes in how I felt. When I mentioned feeling more tired than usual or having trouble concentrating while reading, he'd write it down in a small notebook he'd started carrying. When I asked him about it, he said he was just trying to be helpful, that keeping track might be useful when I saw Dr. Hendricks. The first real warning sign came on a Tuesday morning in September. I'd gotten up early to water the tomatoes before the sun got too hot, and when I came back inside, I found Danny in the kitchen examining my pill organizer. He had that same intense expression he used to get as a child when working on particularly challenging puzzles. "Everything okay?" I asked, hanging my gardening gloves on the hook by the back door. He looked up with a start, closing the organizer quickly. "Fine, just making sure you have everything you need for the week. I've been organizing my own pills for longer than you've been alive, sweetheart. I know, Grandma. I just worry about you, that's all." His concern seemed genuine, and I felt a pang of guilt for being suspicious. Of course he worried. I was the only family he had nearby, and he'd seen what happened when elderly people didn't have support systems. His girlfriend's grandmother had fallen and lain on her kitchen floor for 12 hours before anyone found her. Danny had been the one to drive to the hospital, had seen firsthand how quickly independence could vanish. So when he offered to pick up my prescriptions from the pharmacy the following week, I said yes. It would save me a trip into town, and the new pharmacist there was a surly young man who acted like every customer was an inconvenience. Danny, with his easy smile and professional manner, would probably get better service anyway. He returned from Millfield Pharmacy with a white paper bag that looked exactly like all the others I'd received over the years. Same logo, same receipt stapled to the top, same child-proof caps that required more patience than I usually possessed. I thanked him and put the bag on the counter, planning to sort everything into my weekly organizer after lunch. But when I opened the bag an hour later, something felt different. Not wrong, exactly, just different in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The bottles looked right, the labels seemed correct, but there was something about the pills themselves that gave me pause. My blood pressure medication, usually small white tablets, appeared slightly larger than usual. The antacid I took for my stomach issues looked exactly the same, but felt lighter in the bottle when I shook it. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Pharmaceutical companies changed manufacturers sometimes, and generic medications could look different depending on who produced them. I'd learned that lesson years ago when my cholesterol medication switched from blue tablets to white ones, and I'd spent 20 minutes on the phone with Dr. Hendricks' office in a panic. For the next 2 weeks, I took my medications as prescribed, following the same routine I'd maintained for years. Morning pills with breakfast, afternoon supplements with lunch, evening doses with dinner. But something was wrong, and it took me several days to identify what it was. I was feeling better. Not just better, but significantly better in ways that didn't make sense. The persistent headaches that had plagued me for months were gone. The digestive issues that had made me avoid certain foods had disappeared. Most noticeably, the brain fog that had made reading and conversation increasingly difficult was lifting like morning mist off the lake. At first I attributed the improvement to having Danny around. Maybe the stress of living alone had been affecting me more than I'd realized. Maybe having someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, had improved my overall well-being in ways that impacted my physical health. It wasn't uncommon for elderly people to see health improvements when they had more social interaction. But the changes were too dramatic, too sudden to be explained by companionship alone. I'd been dealing with these issues for the better part of a year, and my doctor had attributed them to normal aging, to the cumulative effects of my various medications, to the grief process following Frank's death. Sudden, complete resolution didn't fit that pattern. The realization came to me on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner. Danny was working late at the research facility, something about a project deadline, and I was alone with my thoughts for the first time in weeks. I was browning onions for a beef stew, enjoying the simple pleasure of cooking without the fatigue that had made even basic tasks challenging for months, when it hit me. I hadn't felt this good in over a year. Not since before I'd started taking the new medication Dr. Hendricks had prescribed for my blood pressure. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. I went to the kitchen counter where I kept my current medications and examined each bottle carefully. The labels were correct. The pharmacy information was accurate, even the lot numbers looked legitimate. But the more I studied them, the more convinced I became that something was wrong, not with the bottles or the labels, but with the contents. That night, I called my daughter Linda. It was past 9 o'clock, later than I usually called, but I needed to talk to someone who knew me well enough to tell me if I was losing my mind. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound upset." I'd always been close to Linda, perhaps because she was my only child, and we'd gone through Frank's illness and death together. She lived far enough away that she couldn't visit often, but we talked several times a week, and she had a good sense of my day-to-day life. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Over the past few months, when we've talked, have I seemed different to you? Confused, forgetful, not like myself?" There was a long pause. "You've seemed tired, Mom. Overwhelmed sometimes. You've mentioned feeling foggy, having trouble concentrating. I've been worried about you actually." "Why do you ask?" I told her about the past 2 weeks, about feeling dramatically better, about my suspicions regarding my medications. As I spoke, I could hear the concern in her silence. "Danny's been picking up your prescriptions?" she asked, when I finished. "Yes, he offered to help, and it seemed like such a thoughtful gesture." "Mom, you need to call Dr. Hendricks first thing tomorrow morning. Don't take any more of those medications until you talk to him." But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just having a good couple of weeks, and I'm imagining connections that aren't there? Then Dr. Hendricks will tell you that, and you'll know your medications are fine. But if you're right, if something is wrong with your prescriptions, you need to know immediately. After we hung up, I sat in Frank's old recliner and stared at the bottles lined up on the coffee table. 7 different medications, each one prescribed for a specific condition, each one a small but significant part of keeping me healthy and independent. The idea that someone might have tampered with them, might have replaced them with something else entirely, was almost too frightening to contemplate. But the alternative, that I was developing paranoid delusions about my own grandson, was equally terrifying. I'd read about elderly people who became suspicious of family members, who accused loved ones of stealing or conspiring against them. I'd always assumed those stories involved people who were genuinely confused, whose mental faculties were compromised by age or illness. I'd never imagined I might become one of those people. The next morning, I called Dr. Hendricks' office as soon as they opened. His receptionist, Mrs. Chen, had been there for 15 years, and knew me well enough to hear the worry in my voice. "Rose, what's troubling you?" I explained the situation as clearly as I could, trying to stick to facts rather than suspicions. "I'd been feeling better," I said, "and I was concerned that my medications might not be what they were supposed to be. Could Dr. Hendricks see me as soon as possible? He has an opening at 11:30 this morning. Can you make it in?" I could, and I did, driving the 12 miles to the medical center with my stomach in knots. Dr. Hendricks had been my physician for over 20 years, had seen me through Frank's illness and my own various health challenges. If anyone would take my concerns seriously, without dismissing them as the worries of an aging woman, it would be him. His examination was thorough. He checked my blood pressure, listened to my heart, asked detailed questions about how I'd been feeling. When I described the improvement in my symptoms, his expression grew increasingly serious. "Rose, I want you to bring in all of your current medications, every bottle, every pill. Can you do that this afternoon?" "Of course, but Dr. Hendricks, do you think someone could have tampered with them?" He was quiet for a moment, making notes in my chart. "I think we need to be very careful and very thorough before we jump to any conclusions. But yes, what you're describing is concerning enough that we need to investigate." I drove home with my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. The validation of my concerns should have been reassuring, but instead it made everything feel more real, more dangerous.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Hendricks was worried enough to want to examine my medications immediately. Then my suspicions weren't the product of an aging mind seeking patterns where none existed. Danny's car was in the driveway when I got home, which surprised me since he usually worked until late afternoon. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his laptop open and my pill organizer in front of him. "How was your doctor's appointment?" he asked, without looking up. "Fine, just a routine checkup." I wasn't ready to share my suspicions with him, not until I had more information. "You're home early. Slow day at the lab. I thought I'd work from home this afternoon, maybe cook dinner for us tonight." I watched him type something into his laptop, occasionally glancing at my pill organizer. The scene looked innocent enough, a thoughtful grandson researching healthy meal options for his elderly grandmother, but my newfound suspicions cast everything in a different light. "What are you working on?" I asked, moving closer to see his screen. He closed the laptop quickly. "Just some research for work, nothing exciting." That afternoon, while Danny was supposedly working in his room, I gathered all of my medications and drove back to Dr. Hendricks' office. His nurse, a competent woman named Patricia, who'd been there almost as long as Mrs. Chen, examined each bottle carefully. "We're going to send these to a lab for analysis," she explained. "It will take a few days to get results, but we'll be able to tell you exactly what's in each container. And in the meantime, Dr. Hendricks wants you to stop taking everything except your heart medication. That one looks correct, and it's too dangerous to discontinue. For everything else, we'll write new prescriptions and you'll pick them up yourself from a different pharmacy." The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. I followed Dr. Hendricks' instructions, taking only my heart medication and avoiding everything else. To my surprise, I continued to feel good, perhaps even better than I had while taking what I'd believed were my prescribed medications. Danny seemed increasingly agitated. He asked repeatedly about my doctor's appointment, whether Dr. Hendricks had changed any of my prescriptions, if I was feeling all right. When I told him I was feeling fine, he'd press for details. Was I having any headaches, any digestive issues, any problems with concentration or memory? His questions felt less like concern, and more like a medical evaluation, which struck me as odd for someone whose background was in biochemistry rather than medicine. But then again, perhaps his scientific training made him naturally observant about health-related changes. On Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Hendricks' office called with the lab results. Mrs. Chen's voice was carefully neutral when she asked me to come in immediately to discuss the findings with the doctor. I drove to the medical center with my heart pounding, unsure whether I was hoping to be proven right or wrong. Being wrong would mean my medications were legitimate and my grandson wasn't involved in anything untoward, but it would also mean I was developing paranoid delusions about someone I loved. Being right would vindicate my suspicions but open up questions I wasn't sure I was prepared to answer. Dr. Hendricks met me in his office rather than an examination room, which told me this conversation was going to be more serious than a typical appointment. He had a folder open on his desk, and his expression was grim. "Rose, I need you to sit down. The lab results are quite disturbing." He handed me a detailed report that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Chemical names, molecular structures, concentration levels, none of it meant anything to me. But Dr. Hendricks' explanation was crystal clear. 5 of your 7 medications have been replaced with completely different substances. Your blood pressure medication contains sugar pills. Your cholesterol medication has been replaced with vitamins. Most concerning, your antacid has been replaced with something that's essentially a mild stimulant. I stared at the papers in my hands, trying to process what he was telling me. Replaced by whom? That's not a medical question, Rose. That's a question for the police. The word hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Police, investigation, criminal activity. The idea that my own grandson might be involved in something that required law enforcement seemed surreal. There's more, Dr. Hendricks continued. The substances that replaced your medications aren't random. Someone with a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology chose replacements that would mask the absence of your real medications while creating the illusion that you were improving. The stimulant, for instance, would counteract the fatigue and brain fog that would result from not taking your prescribed antacid. Someone was trying to make me think I was getting better. Someone was trying to make you think your original medications were making you worse. By replacing them with substances that temporarily alleviated your symptoms, they created a situation where you'd feel dramatically better, while believing your prescribed medications were the problem. I thought about the past few weeks, about how good I'd felt, how clear my thinking had become. It hadn't been natural improvement, or the benefits of Danny's companionship. It had been a carefully orchestrated deception designed to make me lose faith in my doctor, my medications, and ultimately my own judgment. Why would someone do this? Dr. Hendricks leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. I can think of several reasons, none of them good, to make you appear mentally incompetent. To convince you that you're sicker than you actually are. To gain control over your medical decisions. He paused. Rose, who has access to your medications? The answer was obvious, but saying it out loud felt like a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about my family. My grandson Danny, he's been living with me for 6 months, and he's been picking up my prescriptions for the past few weeks. Dr. Hendricks made notes in his chart. We need to file a report with the authorities. This kind of medication tampering is a serious crime, and if your grandson is involved, he needs to be investigated. I left the medical center with my head spinning and my heart breaking. The grandson I'd welcomed into my home, the young man I'd been proud to help during a difficult time in his life, had apparently been conducting some kind of medical experiment on me. But why? What could he possibly gain from making me distrust my medications or my doctor? The answer came to me as I pulled into my driveway and saw Danny's car parked in its usual spot. If someone wanted to gain control over an elderly person's life, the first step would be to undermine their confidence in their own judgment. Make them question their medical care, their mental competence, their ability to live independently. Create a situation where they'd be grateful for help, willing to sign over decision-making authority to someone they trusted. Someone like a devoted grandson who'd moved home to take care of his aging grandmother. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the house that had been my sanctuary for 37 years. Frank and I had bought it when Danny's father was still in elementary school, had raised our son here, had planned to spend our retirement here together. Now it felt like hostile territory, a place where someone I loved had been systematically poisoning me while pretending to care for my welfare. But I wasn't going to let fear drive me from my own home, not without a fight. When I walked through the front door, Danny was waiting for me in the living room, that same intense expression on his face that I'd learned to associate with his questions about my health. "How was your appointment, Grandma?" "Everything okay." I looked at this young man who shared my late son's eyes and my husband's stubborn chin, who'd helped me plant tomatoes in the spring and had fixed my leaky faucet without being asked. The grandson who'd apparently been slowly poisoning me for weeks. "Everything's fine, Danny. Dr. Hendricks just wanted to check on a few things." But even as I spoke the words, I was planning my next move. Because if Danny thought he could manipulate a 76-year-old widow into questioning her own sanity, he was about to learn that his grandmother had quite a few surprises left in her. That evening, I called my neighbor Margaret Holloway, a retired nurse who lived 3 houses down from me. Margaret and I had been friends for over 20 years, had weathered neighborhood changes and personal losses together. If anyone would understand the medical implications of what I'd discovered, it would be her. "Rose, you sound shaken. What's happened?" I told her everything, from Danny's initial helpfulness to the lab results that had turned my world upside down. Margaret listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds of dismay that told me she understood the gravity of the situation. "My God, Rose, that's not just medication tampering, that's systematic abuse. The level of knowledge required to choose those specific substitutions, the planning involved, this isn't some impulsive act by a confused young man. But why would he do this to me? I've given him nothing but love and support." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Honey, this isn't about love or family loyalty, this is about control, and probably money. Have you made any changes to your will recently? Given Danny any power of attorney documents? Discussed your estate planning with him?" The question hit me like cold water. 3 weeks ago, Danny had mentioned that I should probably update my will, especially since he was living with me now and helping with day-to-day care. He'd even offered to research estate planning attorneys in the area, said he'd be happy to drive me to appointments and help me understand the legal terminology. At the time, I'd been touched by his thoughtfulness. Now I realized it might have been part of a larger plan. "Margaret, I need to ask you a favor. Tomorrow morning, could you come over and witness something for me? I want to document everything that's happened, and I need someone reliable to verify that I'm thinking clearly." "Of course. What time?" "Early. Before Danny leaves for work. I want him to see that I'm not as isolated as he thinks I am." After I hung up, I spent the evening planning my approach. Danny had been conducting what amounted to a scientific experiment on me, documenting my responses, adjusting variables to achieve specific outcomes. If I was going to expose him, I needed to be equally methodical in gathering evidence. I started by searching his room while he was in the shower. I felt terrible about violating his privacy, but the man who'd been systematically poisoning me had forfeited any right to trust. In the top drawer of his desk, I found a notebook filled with detailed observations about my behavior, my health complaints, my daily routines. The entries read like a medical chart, complete with dates, times, and clinical assessments of my mental state. September 15th. Subject complained of headache lasting 3 days. Appeared confused when discussing medication schedule. Suggested she might benefit from help organizing pills. September 22nd. Subject agreed to allow me to collect prescriptions. Substituted BP medication with placebo as planned. Will monitor for improvement in reported symptoms. October 3rd. Subject reports significant improvement in energy levels and mental clarity. Attributes improvement to having companionship. Good response to intervention. October 10th. Subject questioning medication effectiveness. Redirected conversation to benefits of my assistance with daily tasks. Subject agreed to discuss estate planning. Page after page of observations, each entry more damning than the last. Danny hadn't just been tampering with my medications. He'd been studying me like a laboratory animal, documenting my responses to his manipulations. The clinical detachment in his notes was perhaps more disturbing than the deception itself. At the back of the notebook, I found photocopies of my original prescriptions and detailed research about each medication's effects and potential substitutes. He'd done his homework thoroughly, understanding not just what each drug did, but how to replicate or counteract its effects using readily available substances. The final section contained what appeared to be a timeline, with target dates for various milestones. Subject expresses concerns about mental competency, was scheduled for mid-October. Subject requests help with legal documents was planned for early November. Power of attorney discussions was penciled in for Thanksgiving week. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking with anger and betrayal. This wasn't a confused young man making poor decisions. This was a calculated campaign to undermine my independence and gain control over my life and assets. The next morning, Margaret arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, just as Danny was finishing his breakfast. He looked surprised to see her, and I caught a flash of annoyance in his expression before he managed a polite smile. "Mrs. Holloway, good to see you. Is everything all right?" I asked Margaret to stop by. I said before she could answer. "We're going to document something important, and I wanted a witness." Danny's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Document what?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the photographs I'd taken of his notebook. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally resignation. "I can explain this, Grandma." "I'm sure you can, but first I want you to look at these lab results." I handed him the report from Dr. Hendricks' office. "They show exactly what was in the medications you've been bringing me." Margaret leaned forward to read over his shoulder, her professional training evident in how quickly she processed the technical information. "Danny, this is evidence of systematic medication tampering. Do you understand how serious this is?" He set down the papers and looked directly at me, and for a moment I saw something of the little boy he'd once been. The child who'd spent summers at this house learning to fish with his grandfather, and helping me make jam from the wild berries that grew behind the garage. "Grandma, I was trying to help you. You were taking too many medications, experiencing side effects that were making your life miserable. I wanted to show you that you could feel better without all those chemicals. By lying to me, by conducting medical experiments without my knowledge or consent, by giving you the chance to see what you could feel like if you weren't over-medicated by doctors who see you as a collection of symptoms rather than a person." Margaret's voice was sharp with professional outrage. "Danny, you're not qualified to make those decisions. Those medications were prescribed for serious conditions. By replacing them with placebos, you could have caused serious harm. But I didn't cause harm. She feels better now than she has in months." "That's not the point," I said, standing up from the table. "The point is that you deceived me, manipulated me, and violated my trust in ways I'm still trying to understand. But what I understand perfectly is what you were planning to do next." I showed him the timeline from his notebook, the carefully planned progression from undermining my confidence to gaining legal control over my affairs. "This wasn't about helping me feel better, Danny. This was about convincing me that I couldn't take care of myself." His facade of righteous concern finally cracked. "You're 76 years old, Grandma. You live alone in a house that's too big for you, taking medications you don't understand for conditions you can't pronounce. At some point, someone needs to help you make rational decisions about your future, and you decided that someone should be you. Who else? Dad's been out of the picture since the divorce. Aunt Linda lives halfway across the country and calls twice a week out of obligation. I'm the only family you have who actually cares enough to be here." Margaret stood up, her nursing background evident in the authoritative way she addressed him. "Danny, what you've done isn't care. It's abuse. You've systematically undermined your grandmother's health care, violated her autonomy, and manipulated her for your own purposes. That's not love, that's exploitation." "I haven't exploited anyone. I've been living here for 6 months, helping with maintenance, keeping her company, making sure she's safe. If I'd wanted to exploit her, there are easier ways to do it. Like convincing her to sign power of attorney documents while she's questioning her own mental competency." I asked. like gaining legal control over her assets while she's grateful for your help and confused about her medical care. He had the grace to look ashamed, but his voice remained defiant. I never asked you to sign anything. I only suggested that you should have updated legal documents in case something happened to you. After you spent weeks making me doubt my own judgment and question my ability to live independently. The argument might have continued, but the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a police car in my driveway. Danny saw it too, and his defiance crumbled into panic. "Grandma, you called the police." Dr. Hendricks called the police. Medication tampering is a crime, Danny, especially when it's done to vulnerable elderly people. The next hour passed in a blur of official questions, evidence collection, and formal statements. The officers were thorough and professional, treating me with the respect I'd feared I might not receive. One of them, Officer Martinez, was particularly skilled at asking questions that revealed the scope of Danny's deception without making me feel foolish for having trusted him. They photographed the notebook, collected samples of the tampered medications, and took detailed statements from both Margaret and me. Danny requested an attorney and said little beyond confirming his name and address. As they prepared to take him away, he looked back at me with something that might have been genuine remorse. "I really was trying to help you, Grandma. I know you don't believe that now, but it's true. I believe you thought you were helping," I said. "But what you were really doing was deciding that your judgment was more important than mine, your choices more valid than mine, your plans for my life more reasonable than my own. That's not help, Danny, that's theft." After the police left with Danny in custody, Margaret stayed with me while I called Linda. The conversation was every bit as difficult as I'd expected it to be. "Mom, I can't believe this. Danny seemed so devoted to you, so concerned about your welfare." He was concerned about my welfare, in his own twisted way, but he was more concerned about controlling my life and gaining access to my assets. What happens now? I looked around my kitchen, at the familiar surroundings that had been violated by someone I'd loved and trusted. Now I figure out how to trust my own judgment again, how to live independently, without second-guessing every decision I make. "Do you want me to come stay with you for a while? I could take some time off work." The offer was tempting, but I recognized it as another form of the same impulse that had driven Danny's behavior. The assumption that I needed someone else to take care of me, to make decisions for me, to protect me from my own supposed incompetence. "I appreciate the offer, honey, but I think I need to prove to myself that I can handle this on my own. I've been living independently for 4 years since your father died, and I was doing fine until Danny decided I needed his version of help." Over the next few weeks, as the legal process unfolded, I learned more about the scope of Danny's deception. His research at the pharmaceutical company had given him access to information about drug interactions and side effects that he'd used to select the most effective substitutes for my medications. He'd been planning his approach for months before moving in with me, studying my medical history and developing what amounted to a comprehensive strategy for undermining my independence. The prosecutor handling the case explained that elder abuse involving medication tampering was becoming increasingly common, often perpetrated by family members who convinced themselves they were acting in their loved one's best interests while pursuing their own financial advantages. "Your grandson's case is particularly sophisticated," she told me during one of our meetings. "Most medication tampering involves simple substitution or dilution. What he did required extensive knowledge of pharmacology and careful monitoring of your responses. It's more like medical fraud than typical elder abuse." The trial, when it came, was both vindicating and heartbreaking. The evidence against Danny was overwhelming, from the notebook documenting his experiments to the lab results showing the specific substitutions he'd made. His defense attorney tried to argue that his intentions were benevolent, that he genuinely believed he was helping me, but the prosecutor's presentation of his timeline and planning documents made it clear that his ultimate goal had been gaining control over my life and assets. Danny pled guilty to charges of elder abuse, medication tampering, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison and ordered him to pay restitution for my medical expenses and emotional distress. But the most important moment came during the victim impact statement I delivered at his sentencing hearing. I'd spent weeks deciding what to say, how to express the depth of his betrayal, without losing sight of the love I'd once felt for him. "Your Honor, the defendant is my grandson, a young man I welcomed into my home and tried to help during a difficult time in his life. What he did to me wasn't just criminal. It was a profound violation of the trust that forms the foundation of family relationships. He didn't just tamper with my medications, he tampered with my sense of reality, my confidence in my own judgment, my faith in my ability to live independently. He made me question not just my health, but my sanity, my competence, my worth as a human being. But perhaps most damaging of all, he made me afraid to trust other people who might genuinely want to help me. His betrayal didn't just hurt me, it isolated me, making me suspicious of offers of assistance that might be perfectly legitimate. I want the court to understand that elder abuse isn't just about stealing money or property. It's about stealing dignity, autonomy, and self-respect. It's about reducing complex human beings to objects to be manipulated for someone else's benefit. My grandson may have convinced himself that he was acting in my best interests, but what he was really doing was deciding that his judgment was more important than mine, that his plans for my life were more valid than my own choices. That's not love, Your Honor. That's exploitation disguised as care. I hope the sentence you impose today will send a message that elderly people are not disposable, that our autonomy and dignity matter, and that family relationships don't give anyone the right to manipulate or control another person's life. After the sentencing, I drove home to the house that had been both sanctuary and crime scene, the place where I'd been victimized, and where I'd found the strength to fight back. Margaret had helped me change the locks and update my security system, practical measures that made me feel safer, but couldn't address the emotional damage Danny had inflicted. The hardest part wasn't learning to trust my own judgment again, though that took time and effort. The hardest part was learning to accept help from people who genuinely wanted to assist me without ulterior motives. Margaret, Linda, Doc Hendricks, even the young pharmacist at Millfield Pharmacy, who'd seemed surly but turned out to be merely efficient. All of them had to prove repeatedly that their concern was genuine before I could believe it. But gradually, over months of therapy and careful relationship building, I regained my confidence in my ability to distinguish between helpful support and manipulative control. I learned to ask questions, to verify information, to trust but verify, as the saying goes. 6 months after Danny's sentencing, I received a letter from him in prison. It was full of apologies and explanations, attempts to justify his behavior while acknowledging its harmful effects. He claimed he'd learned from his mistakes, that he understood now how wrong he'd been, that he hoped someday I might be able to forgive him. I read the letter twice, then put it in my desk drawer without answering. Forgiveness might come eventually, but it would have to be earned through actions, not words. And Danny was no longer in a position to take actions that affected my life. The real resolution came not from his apologies or the court's justice, but from my own recovery of agency and independence. I hired a new handyman to help with household maintenance, a retired carpenter named Bill, who charged fair rates and never asked about my medical care or financial situation. I found a new pharmacy in the next town over, one where the staff knew me by name but respected my privacy. Most importantly, I reclaimed my daily routines and decisions, taking my medications on my own schedule, managing my health care with Dr. Hendricks' guidance, but without anyone else's interference, living my life according to my own choices rather than someone else's idea of what was best for me. One evening, about a year after Danny's arrest, I was sitting on my back porch watching the sunset when Linda called. She'd been checking on me more frequently since the trial, not because she thought I couldn't take care of myself, but because she'd realized how much she'd missed our regular conversations when geography kept us apart. "How are you doing, Mom?" Really doing, not just the polite answer you give when people ask. I thought about the question seriously. How was I doing? I was 77 years old, living alone in a house that was probably too big for me, taking medications I didn't fully understand for conditions I couldn't pronounce. But I was making my own decisions about all of it, choosing my own doctors, managing my own medications, deciding for myself what risks were acceptable and what help I needed. I'm doing well, honey, better than well, actually. I'm doing exactly what I want to do, exactly how I want to do it, for exactly as long as I'm able to do it. And when you're not able anymore, then I'll make different choices, but they'll be my choices, made with good information and trusted advisors, not manipulations disguised as care. After we hung up, I remained on the porch until full darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of my neighborhood settling into evening. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car door slammed, Someone called their children inside for the night. Ordinary sounds of ordinary lives being lived by ordinary people making their own choices about how to spend their time and energy. I'd learned the hard way that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. But I'd also learned that independence, once reclaimed, is worth protecting at any cost. Danny had taught me both lessons, though not in the way he'd intended. The pills I took each morning were the right ones now, prescribed by a doctor I trusted and filled by a pharmacist who understood their importance. But more than that, they were my pills, taken by my choice, on my schedule, as part of my plan for maintaining my health and independence. That was the real victory, not Danny's conviction or even his acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The real victory was the simple act of making my own decisions about my own life, of trusting my own judgment while remaining open to genuine help when I needed it. At 77, I was finally learning the difference between assistance and control, between care and manipulation, between love and exploitation. It had taken a betrayal by someone I trusted to teach me those distinctions, but the education, however painful, had been worth the price. As I locked the front door and turned off the porch lights, I smiled at the irony. Danny had set out to convince me that I couldn't take care of myself, that I needed someone else to make decisions for me, that my independence was an illusion. Instead, he'd taught me just how capable I really was, how strong I could be when I needed to be, how much I valued my autonomy and dignity. Some lessons come from teachers we choose, others come from teachers we never expected. Danny had been the second kind, and while I wouldn't have chosen the curriculum he offered, I was grateful for the education I'd received. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the furnace humming, the refrigerator cycling on, the old floorboards creaking in their accustomed places. But tonight, those sounds didn't just mean home, they meant freedom, independence, and the hard-won knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged, making exactly the choices I wanted to make. 2 years had passed since Danny's sentencing, and I'd settled into a routine that felt both familiar and refreshingly new. My morning ritual of sorting medications had become a small act of defiance, each pill a deliberate choice, rather than an obligation imposed by someone else's judgment. I took my time with it, reading each label carefully, understanding what each medication did and why I needed it. Dr. Hendricks had been patient in explaining the science behind my prescriptions, treating me as a partner in my care, rather than a passive recipient of medical decisions. The knock on my door that Tuesday morning came just as I was finishing my breakfast. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman about Danny's age, blonde hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a navy suit that looked expensive but not flashy. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and stood with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "Mrs. Callahan, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm a social worker with the county's Adult Protective Services Division. I was wondering if I might speak with you for a few minutes." Adult Protective Services. The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October weather. I'd heard about APS visits, how they could spiral into investigations that stripped elderly people of their independence faster than any family member with ulterior motives. "What is this regarding?" I asked through the door. "We've received some concerns about your welfare, ma'am. Nothing serious, but we're required to follow up on all reports. May I come in?" I unlocked the door, but kept the chain engaged, studying her through the gap. She looked genuine enough, but Danny had looked genuine too. "What kind of concerns?" "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. I have identification, and you're welcome to call our office to verify who I am." Against my better judgment, I let her in. She accepted my offer of coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the easy familiarity of someone who spent her days in other people's homes. But there was something in her manner that suggested she was assessing me, even as we made small talk about the weather and the neighborhood. "Mrs. Callahan, I'll be direct with you. We received a call from someone who expressed worry about your ability to live independently. They mentioned that you'd had some trouble with family members recently, that you might be isolated and vulnerable to exploitation." "Who made this report?" "I'm not at liberty to share that information, but I can tell you that the caller seemed genuinely concerned about your welfare." I set down my coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Let me guess. They suggested that I might be confused, possibly showing signs of dementia, maybe having trouble managing my medications or my finances. Jennifer's expression sharpened. Those were among the concerns mentioned, yes. How did you know that? I told her about Danny, about the systematic deception he'd practiced, about the trial and conviction that had made local news. As I spoke, I watched her face cycle through surprise, professional interest, and what might have been genuine anger on my behalf. Mrs. Callahan, I had no idea about your grandson's case when I received this referral. That changes things significantly. Does it, or are you still required to complete your assessment regardless of the circumstances? She was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing her words carefully. I am required to complete an assessment, but knowing about your recent experiences makes me much more suspicious about the motivations of whoever made this report. What kind of assessment? I need to observe your living conditions, discuss your daily routines, understand your symptoms and safety plans. I also need to ask about your finances, your medical care, your ability to manage daily tasks independently. Everything Danny had been working toward before his arrest. The irony was bitter enough to taste. And if you determine that I'm not capable of independent living, then we'd work together to develop a plan that ensures your safety while preserving as much independence as possible. But Mrs. Callahan, based on this conversation alone, I'm not seeing any indicators that would suggest you can't live independently. The assessment took 2 hours. Jennifer was thorough but respectful, asking detailed questions about my routines, my medical care, my financial management. She examined my medication organization system, reviewed my grocery shopping habits, discussed my emergency contacts and safety plans. She even asked to see my checkbook and recent bank statements, which I provided after she explained that financial exploitation was often the first sign of vulnerability. Your record keeping is meticulous, she said, reviewing the careful notes I kept about medical appointments, medication changes, and household expenses. Most people half your age aren't this organized. I learned to be careful about documentation during my grandson's trial. My lawyer said that detailed records would be important if anyone ever questioned my competency again. Smart advice. She closed her portfolio and looked at me directly. Mrs. Callahan, I'm going to be frank with you. This referral has all the hallmarks of a malicious report, possibly made by someone who wants to create problems for you rather than solve them. What do you mean? The complaints were vague but serious, exactly the kind of allegations that would trigger a mandatory investigation. The caller claimed to be a concerned neighbor, but refused to provide contact information. They mentioned specific concerns about medication management and financial vulnerability that mirror common elder abuse scenarios. I felt the familiar twist of anger and betrayal in my stomach. Someone's trying to manufacture a case against me. That's my assessment, yes. The question is who and why. We discussed the possibilities. Danny was in prison and had no access to outside communication beyond supervised phone calls and monitored mail. His father, my ex-son-in-law, had never shown any interest in my life or welfare. Linda was the only family member who maintained regular contact with me, and she'd been nothing but supportive since Danny's arrest. What about friends of your grandson? Jennifer asked. People who might blame you for his incarceration. I thought about Danny's college friends, the few young people he'd introduced me to during his time living here. Most had seemed nice enough, though I'd never gotten to know any of them well. But there was one who'd stood out, a young man named Marcus, who'd visited several times and had seemed particularly interested in my house, my routines, my financial situation. There was a friend of Danny's who came around fairly often, I said. Marcus something. He always asked a lot of questions about the neighborhood, about my late husband's military pension, about the value of the house. Jennifer made notes. Did Danny ever discuss you with this friend while you were present? Now that I think about it, yes. He talked about how I was having trouble managing on my own, how I needed help with daily tasks. At the time I thought he was just explaining why he'd moved in with me, but looking back, it felt like he was building a narrative. A narrative that Marcus might now be trying to use against you. The possibility was disturbing but not surprising. Danny's betrayal had taught me that people could maintain friendly facades while planning elaborate deceptions. If he'd shared his observations and strategies with friends, one of them might have decided to continue his work. What happens now? I asked. I file a report stating that you're fully capable of independent living, and that the concerns raised in the referral appear to be unfounded. I also note my suspicions about the motivations behind the report, which will make it harder for anyone to file similar complaints without providing substantial evidence. And if they try again, then we'll be ready for them. Mrs. Callahan, you've been through enough. I'm going to make sure our office understands your situation so that any future reports are viewed with appropriate skepticism. After Jennifer left, I called Margaret to tell her about the visit. She was outraged on my behalf and immediately offered to be more visible in her support, to make it clear to anyone watching that I had strong advocates in the community. Rose, this is harassment, plain and simple. Someone's trying to continue Danny's work by using the system against you. But who, and why, does it matter? What matters is stopping them before they succeed. Margaret was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that understanding the motivation was important to preventing future attacks. That evening I called Linda to tell her about the APS visit. Mom, this is awful. Do you think it could be Marcus? You mentioned him a few times when Danny was living with you. It's possible. He seemed very interested in my business for someone who was supposedly just a friend of Danny's. I have an idea. Give me a day or two to do some research. I still have Danny's old email address, and I might be able to figure out who his closest friends were during that period. Linda called back 2 days later with information that confirmed my suspicions. She'd managed to access some of Danny's old social media accounts, and Marcus had been posting messages expressing anger about Danny's conviction, claiming that Danny had been unfairly persecuted for trying to help his grandmother. Mom, there are posts going back months where Marcus talks about how the system failed Danny, how elderly people use abuse allegations to punish family members who try to help them. He's built up this whole narrative where you're the villain and Danny's the victim. So he's trying to prove his point by getting me declared incompetent. That's what it looks like. He's even posted about how easy it is to trigger APS investigations with anonymous reports. I felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was tempered with determination rather than fear. I'd defeated Danny's manipulations by being smarter, more prepared, and more resilient than he'd expected. If Marcus wanted to continue that fight, he'd find that I'd learned some valuable lessons about protecting myself. The next morning I called Jennifer Walsh to share Linda's discoveries. She listened carefully and asked me to forward copies of the social media posts Linda had found. This is exactly what I suspected, she said when I finished. Mrs. Callahan, I want to discuss some protective measures we can put in place to prevent future harassment. Jennifer explained that APS could flag my case to indicate that any future reports should be thoroughly vetted before triggering investigations. She also suggested that I document my daily activities more extensively, creating a paper trail that would demonstrate my competency and independence. I also want to put you in touch with a victim advocate who specializes in elder abuse cases. What you're experiencing now is a form of continued abuse, and you deserve support in stopping it. The victim advocate, a woman named Sarah Chen who'd worked with elderly crime victims for over a decade, met with me the following week. She helped me understand that Danny's conviction hadn't necessarily ended my victimization, it had simply changed the form it took. Abusers often have enablers or supporters who continue their work after they're no longer able to do it themselves, she explained. In your case, it sounds like your grandson shared his methods and motivations with friends who now feel justified in carrying on his mission. Sarah helped me develop a comprehensive safety plan that went beyond the practical measures I'd already taken. We discussed how to recognize manipulation tactics, how to verify the credentials of anyone claiming official authority, how to document incidents that might be part of a larger pattern of harassment. The most important thing, she said, is to trust your instincts. You survived your grandson's deception because you recognized that something was wrong and took action. Don't let anyone convince you that your perceptions are unreliable. Over the next few months, I received 3 more unexpected visits from people claiming various forms of official authority. A woman who said she was from the health department wanting to inspect my home for safety violations. A man who claimed to be from the IRS investigating my tax compliance. A young woman who said she was a Medicare fraud investigator checking on my prescription drug usage. Each time I followed the protocols Sarah had helped me develop. I asked for identification, verified their credentials by calling the agencies they claimed to represent, and refused to discuss anything until I'd confirmed their legitimacy. In every case, the agencies had no record of sending representatives to my home. The pattern was clear: someone was systematically trying to create official documentation of problems with my living situation, my health, or my financial management. If they succeeded in generating enough reports, they might eventually trigger a more serious investigation that could result in my being declared incompetent. But they'd underestimated my ability to recognize and counter their tactics. Each failed attempt was documented and reported to the appropriate authorities. Jennifer Walsh kept detailed records of every incident, building a case for harassment that could be used to prosecute whoever was behind the campaign. The breakthrough came when Margaret happened to be visiting during one of the fake official visits. She recognized the young woman claiming to be a Medicare investigator as someone she'd seen around the neighborhood several times, always in the company of a young man who matched my description of Marcus. "Rose, I think we've found our harassment team," Margaret said after the woman left. "I'm going to start paying closer attention to any strangers in the neighborhood, especially ones who seem to be watching your house." Margaret's surveillance paid off 2 weeks later when she photographed Marcus and the fake Medicare investigator sitting in a car across from my house, apparently planning their next approach. The photographs, combined with the documented pattern of false official visits, gave law enforcement enough evidence to investigate. Marcus was arrested on charges of elder abuse, criminal harassment, and impersonating government officials. The woman with him turned out to be his girlfriend, who'd been recruited to play various official roles in their campaign against me. During their interrogation, they admitted to conducting what they called a justice campaign, to prove that Danny had been wrongly convicted. The arrest made local news, and I found myself once again in the position of having to defend my competency and independence in public. But this time the narrative was different. Instead of being portrayed as a confused elderly woman who'd maliciously prosecuted her helpful grandson, I was described as a strong survivor who'd successfully fought off multiple attempts at exploitation. Dr. Hendricks was quoted in the newspaper article about the case. "Mrs. Callahan is one of the most mentally sharp and organizationally competent patients I've ever had. Anyone who thinks she's vulnerable to manipulation clearly doesn't know her very well." The article brought unexpected support from other elderly people in the community who'd experienced similar harassment or intimidation. Several neighbors I'd barely known reached out to share their own stories of family members or supposed friends who'd tried to convince them they were no longer capable of independent living. "It's more common than people realize," explained Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 streets over and had successfully fought off her nephew's attempts to gain power of attorney. "There are people who see elderly homeowners as easy targets, either for financial exploitation or for the satisfaction of controlling someone they perceive as weak." The community response led to the formation of an informal support network for elderly residents who'd experienced abuse or harassment. We met monthly at the community center, sharing information about protective strategies and warning each other about suspicious activities in our neighborhoods. I found myself in the unexpected role of mentor to people who were just beginning to recognize manipulation in their own lives. My experience with Danny had taught me to identify the subtle signs of someone trying to undermine an elderly person's confidence and independence. "The first thing they do," I explained to a group of about 15 people at one of our meetings, "is convince you that you can't trust your own judgment. They point out small mistakes, express concern about your memory, suggest that you might be overwhelming yourself with responsibilities you used to handle easily." Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. "My nephew kept telling me I was getting confused about my finances, that I should let him help me organize my accounts. When I refused, he started leaving articles about financial scams targeting seniors where I'd be sure to see them. They want you to feel grateful for their help," added Mr. Rodriguez, whose daughter had tried to convince him to sell his house and move to assisted living. They create problems and then offer solutions that give them more control over your life. The meetings were therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Talking with other people who'd experienced similar manipulation helped me process my own anger and sense of betrayal. It also reinforced my understanding that what had happened to me wasn't personal, it was part of a larger pattern of how some people chose to exploit elderly family members and community members. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I received a letter from Danny in prison. It was different from his previous communications, less focused on justifying his behavior and more concerned with understanding the consequences of his actions. Grandma Rose, he wrote, I've been talking with a counselor here about what I did to you, and I'm beginning to understand that my actions weren't really about helping you at all. They were about me feeling important, feeling like I had control over something when my own life felt chaotic and directionless. The letter went on to describe his growing awareness of how his manipulation had affected not just me but other elderly people in his orbit. He'd learned about Marcus's arrest and was horrified that his actions had inspired someone else to continue what he'd started. I want you to know that I've been trying to make amends in the only way I can from here. I've been working with a program that educates inmates about elder abuse, sharing my story as an example of how manipulation can escalate even when it starts with supposedly good intentions. I read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. The counselor at the prison had included a note explaining that Danny's participation in the elder abuse education program was voluntary, and that he'd been sharing his experiences to help other inmates understand the serious impact of their crimes on elderly victims. After much consideration, I wrote back. Not to forgive him, which wasn't something I was ready to do, but to acknowledge his efforts to understand and address the harm he'd caused. Danny, I wrote, I appreciate that you're working to understand what you did and why it was wrong. I hope your participation in the education program helps prevent other people from making similar choices. That said, your understanding doesn't undo the damage you caused or relieve you of responsibility for your actions. The correspondence continued sporadically over the following months. Danny seemed genuinely committed to understanding the impact of his choices, and his letters showed increasing insight into the dynamics of elder abuse and manipulation. He also shared information about other inmates he'd met who'd committed similar crimes, often with justifications that sounded disturbingly familiar. There's a man here who convinced his elderly neighbor to sign over power of attorney so he could help her manage her finances. Danny wrote in one letter, he genuinely believes he was protecting her from scams, even though he ended up stealing $30,000 from her account. He can't understand why everyone considers him a criminal instead of a hero. These glimpses into the mindset of other elder abusers were disturbing but educational. They helped me understand that the manipulation I'd experienced wasn't unique, that there were people who systematically targeted elderly community members with similar tactics and justifications. As my third anniversary since Danny's arrest approached, I reflected on how much my life had changed. I was more cautious about trusting people, but also more confident in my ability to recognize and resist manipulation. I developed a network of genuine supporters who respected my independence while offering appropriate assistance when needed. Most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between help that empowered me and help that diminished me. True assistance preserved my agency and decision-making authority. Manipulation, no matter how it was justified, tried to replace my judgment with someone else's. The support group I'd helped establish had grown to include over 30 regular members and had successfully intervened in several situations where elderly residents were being exploited by family members or supposed friends. We developed relationships with local law enforcement, social services, and medical providers who now understood the prevalence and sophistication of elder abuse in our community. What you've created here, Jennifer Walsh told me during one of our periodic check-ins, is exactly what every community needs. A network of informed, alert elderly residents who look out for each other and refuse to be victims. The work was satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Helping other people recognize and resist manipulation gave meaning to my own experiences with Danny and Marcus. It transformed my victimization into expertise that could protect other vulnerable people. On the anniversary of Danny's arrest, I hosted a dinner for the core members of our support group. We'd weathered individual challenges and supported each other through family crises, health scares, and ongoing attempts at exploitation. We'd also celebrated successes, independence maintained, assets protected, dignity preserved. To survivor solidarity, Margaret proposed as we raised our glasses in a toast. To the wisdom that comes from experience, added Mrs. Patterson. To the strength we found we had, I said, thinking about the frightened, confused woman I'd been 3 years ago when I first discovered Danny's deception. That woman had survived and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined to live life on her own terms. She'd learned that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt selectively and carefully. She'd discovered that independence wasn't about refusing all help, but about choosing the right kind of help from the right people for the right reasons. Most importantly, she'd proven that age didn't automatically make someone vulnerable to manipulation, that experience and wisdom were valuable tools for recognizing and resisting exploitation, and that an elderly person's judgment and autonomy deserved respect rather than replacement. The fight for independence was ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and occasional confrontation with people who underestimated elderly resilience. But it was a fight worth having, a battle that preserved not just individual freedom but the dignity and value of aging itself. As I cleaned up after the dinner and prepared for bed, I reflected on the unexpected trajectory my life had taken. I'd become an advocate, an educator, a mentor to people facing challenges I'd never imagined I'd understand. It wasn't the retirement I'd planned, but it was meaningful work that used skills I'd developed through necessity rather than choice. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, but tonight they seemed to echo with voices of friendship and solidarity, rather than the isolation I'd felt during Danny's manipulation. I'd built something valuable from the wreckage of his betrayal, something that protected not just me but an entire community of people who deserved to age with dignity and independence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation to recognize and resist, new people to educate and support. But tonight I was content with the knowledge that I'd turned my victimization into victory, my vulnerability into strength, my isolation into community. The pills I would take in the morning were mine, prescribed by a doctor I trusted, organized by my own careful hands, taken according to my own informed decisions. That simple act of self-determination represented everything I'd fought to preserve and protect, everything that made the struggle worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.